Welcome, brother, to another volume of the Around the Fire podcast. Ryan Schwartz here with Eric Aumann. And as always, it is a pleasure and an honor to sit around the fire with you and dive into some topics that are often quite present and prevalent in the lives of modern men who are walking a path towards ever-increasing self-mastery and bumping up against the quote-unquote squirmy shit that is par for the course. And today we wanted to talk about a topic that you have likely heard before, likely read books on before, and likely have practiced to some degree. It's a familiar term. It's all about shadow work. And we are going to endeavor to present it through a slightly different lens than you may be accustomed to, and ideally one that can help you identify more clearly when a shadow aspect is arising within your somatic experience, within your emotional reactivity, and steps towards near immediate self-correction, both in the self-observation and how you may transmute that into greater power and freedom. With that, I am in, and I hand it over to Eric to officially open the space.
Thanks, Ryan. So come into a moment of stillness here, finding your way into the center of your body with your awareness. As you inhale, drawing your awareness down into your body and consolidating your awareness onto your midline, which is the line that runs down through your crown and out through the root of your body. And as you really consolidate your awareness more and more onto your midline, focus specifically and centering yourself in your central heart, right in the very center. From that place, we want to activate your physical intelligence, bypassing your mental and spiritual intelligence, and connecting you to the universal intelligence. This is a neutrality practice, one that is important to be able to experience reality inside and outside as it is. This time we call upon the cobalt blue flame to surround this space for this conversation in energetic protection, keeping out anything and everything not in alignment with the highest and best good of each of us individually, both Ryan and myself recording this live as well as all future listeners. We also ask that the physical, etheric, mental, spiritual, and emotional spaces also be fortified, protected, and sealed and guarded for this conversation. We take a moment to honor all of our ancestors who have gone before us, whose shoulders we stand upon, as well as our descendants who will stand upon our shoulders. We honor all the masters, teachers, guides, and all those who support the manifestation of the dream we had for ourselves before we were born. We honor the directions of the north, south, east, and west, Father Sky above, Mother Earth below, the divine spark within and the divine spark without. At this time, as you get real and get present with yourself in your body, I ask that you set your intention to tune into a deeper truth within you and notice what comes up for you. Notice what is time, what is ready to be released at this time, and what is ready to be stepped into at this time. And with that, we seal up the perimeter, sealing, guarding, protecting. We are now in our space around the fire.
So I want to open up this conversation with a scenario that may be familiar in the embodied experience of a listener, or it may not be. And either way, it will illustrate in quite a practical manner how shadow projection, especially through the lens of envy, operates in a day-to-day way, taking it out of this esoteric type of practice with a lot of vagueness around it and into something that is immediately noticeable. So when I was earlier on in my entrepreneurial career, trying to get started in online business, trying to make a living out of that, experiencing a lot of fear around it perhaps not working, a lot of fear around being a failure and almost giving myself pre-baked excuses for why that might be so. I used to experience this really squirmy, sharp, stabby, gnawing feeling within my body when I would witness other men, specifically, other providers, experiencing success in their businesses. It would be gross to feel. It would be shameful to feel. I would not only envy them, but I would experience voices of trying to self-elevate myself in relation to them. Well, at least I am healthy. At least I have a six-pack. At least I'm not burning myself out. I would create stories around their calamity, right? And aspects of their life that would knock them down, right? To bring them back down to quote unquote my level. It was sort of a form of entrepreneurial schadenfreude, right? To take the German word. I would almost want to see them fail a little bit, not totally and completely, but I'd certainly yearn for, at least this aspect of me, would yearn for them to simply get knocked back down because I didn't feel like I could elevate myself. And that pattern persisted for a while, despite me feeling the squirm, seeing it play out, having enough distance from it, right, to not express from that place. And anyone who's ever met me during that times, it's quite unlikely they would have known that I was operating because there was enough distance from it and observation around it. And it brings up a potent example, in my view, of how these shadow aspects operate, the narratives they generate, the projections they create, and the fear, the envy, and even the ill will that often encompasses the whole interplay of it within your body and your experience.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful illustration of what we all experience when we're getting triggered, right? And you mentioned, our lens today is looking at the somatic, how these things show up somatically. The shadow, the traditional definition is that which we hide, suppress, and deny. And so in that scenario, what would you say, Ryan, what part of you or what aspect would you say you were hiding, suppressing, or denying?
Yeah, it was certainly the terror that I would never be a success myself and the extreme levels of shame I felt around that.
Yeah. And so you were hiding that aspect, right?
Correct. Yeah. Big time.
Because you don't want the outside world to know that exists.
Certainly.
Right?
And I could barely admit that to myself that existed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's we're not only hiding it from the world, we're the shadow we hide from ourselves as well. And it's almost, sometimes it's totally an unconscious process.
Right.
And what I think is helpful is to look at that as like a physical thing, like energetically, let's just put numbers to it since we're going to make it really masculine to make it really just super grounded here. Let's say that there were 10 units of energy to what you were hiding, right? And so you hide that and you push it down and you push it out of your view and you store it away deep in the caverns of your psyche and in your body. But 10 units are down there and they're taking up space and they're sharing space with all the other shadow elements.
Mm.
everything else down there. And they naturally don't want to be trapped down
Right.
there because there's emotion mixed in with that. And emotion is energy in motion. So it's
Mm-hmm.
creating this like you're
Yep.
holding back somatically. It's like there's this pressure down there. And
Mm-hmm.
anytime in this circumstance, anytime somebody's out there and they're crushing it in their business, I mean, the closer I imagine, the closer they are to you and your situation. Like if there
Mm-hmm.
was another marketer who was probably newly married and had, and maybe
Yep.
was about to have a kid, right? It would activate it even more, right?
It's funny. You nailed it. Yeah. Because all of a sudden I lost that excuse, right?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Yeah. And there's almost like an inner, like, how fucking dare they,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, how dare they just go around doing this all easy and like
Yeah.
experiencing this like that.
Yep. There's a degree of hatred, even, and that's where the ill
Mm-hmm.
will is generated from because they
Yeah.
made me confront a part of me that I want nothing to fucking do with, right? And
Yeah.
that's the how dare they. How dare they and their mastery trigger a part of me that I have refused to claim and admit is there.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, this is so good. So, when we really look at this, because we want to make this somatic, we want to make it grounded, we want to like help you men understand really what's happening and not philosophically. So if those 10 units of energy that are down there, they're wanting to get free. They don't want to be penned up down there, but they also don't have intelligence to get themselves out in a good way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anytime a man who Ryan is able to, put himself onto and is successful presents, well, the anger and everything is going to come up, and it's like an unintelligent way that those units of energy are coming up because they want to be free.
Mm.
And yet the problem is because it's not a conscious process, it's not a conscious owning and responsibility that is happening for that. It's like they're bouncing up and then they get shoved back down, and then they bounce up again and they get shoved back down, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was it, Ryan, that helped you at some point break through that piece?
That's a good question, right? So, for many years, we're talking about here, several years, it was not so suppressed and repressed. There was like knowledge of it, and that somatic experience would happen every time, right? As you said, those units bouncing because it's an unsuitable dwelling. That's not where they want to be.
Exactly.
And there's no skillful expression that felt safe at the time, right? It's unsafe. It felt unsafe at the time to admit that fully to myself, that I experienced that or that I feel that. It's not something that I felt safe to express to a friend, although in a men's group, that's completely safe. And that's one of the reasons we sit in circle, right? To voice these things that are supposedly and perceptibly too gnarly, too gross, too shameful to bring to the table anywhere else. So there was a degree of self-awareness of it and a difficulty liberating it. And one of the things that became extremely helpful, well, it was two things. It was compassion practice, which in one form of it, actually in most forms of it, it kind of melts away the stories you create around someone, right? You see their humanity, you start desiring and wishing the best for them, which flies in the face of the ill will that shadow projection often has. So those two things couldn't exist. There was a softening that started moving into those shadow fragments, right? And those negative constructs and emotionality around it. And the other was freeing myself of self-judgment, right? That experience actually being allowed, one I can hold, one I can step into a space of greater awareness and clarity, pure awareness, if you will, and hold that without judgment. And holding that without judgment and allowing the intensity of that and the fullness of those suppressed and repressed feelings and ideas fully be felt, seen, witnessed, began to transmute them within that space
Yeah.
of total neutrality. So yeah, I'd say those two things over time, not necessarily instantly, over time repatterned the experience. And then on a more remedial level, challenging myself, right? To when I would view someone who used to trigger that shadow, right? When I would view someone crushing it, experiencing a major win or a success that I wanted, to have this internal mantra of I see you, King, which was essentially honoring or celebrating not just them, right? But I would pierce deeper and celebrate and honor what I would perceive to be the precursors to that success, right? Whether that was the drive, the commitment, the courage, right? The virtues that would have given rise to that accomplishment, so that I wasn't necessarily just commending and giving a false ovation to this achievement, but I would begin to recognize these virtues that were in fact available to me if I would choose to cultivate them myself. And you can't honor in yourself what you refuse to honor in someone else. So that became an addictive, empowering practice, right? To witness the guy crushing it in business, or the dude who is older than me and achieving physical mastery in the gym, right? To look at that, view it beyond the accomplishment itself and say, this man is cultivating levels of commitment, focus, drive, self-love, self-mastery that if achievable within his experience are likely achievable within mine. And man, that's fucking exciting, right? And honoring that.
Yeah. So many gems in there. That's definitely a rewindable piece here. If rewinding is even a thing anymore. I guess we use the 10-second skip, right?
Man, I miss the VHS days.
Yeah.
Good sound effect.
So, yeah. I'll have to cut that out. So there's two pieces there that I'd love to highlight. First, sticking with this imagery of the energy of the 10 units. We talked about that coming up and bouncing, right? Bouncing, what was it bouncing off of? Well, it was bouncing off of a lack of will and capacity to be with that thing, whatever that thing is. And in this case, it was the shame and just the experience that was a hard bounce, right? It was going back down. Self-compassion and lack of judgment creates not a hard ceiling. So when that elevates up and you are able to and decided to take responsibility for experiencing that, it starts to allow that energy to be metabolized, right? And transmuted. And so that energy that comes up is then felt, experienced, and released. And until we do that, that's going to stay down in the shadow, right? There's that charge stays there. And we keep acting out sideways or unconsciously, which looks like that energy bouncing up and slamming it back down. And often when we do that, just like any alchemical reaction where there's an energetic charge inside of a container and that charge gets agitated, it grows in power. And so our shadow can gain strength the more we bounce it up and down, refusing to acknowledge and soften and look at it. So that's a piece I think, piggybacking on what you shared, is really important from an energetic and a somatic perspective, to be able to really understand what's happening in your body when you're doing shadow work or not doing shadow work, right?
Yeah. That's a great point. The one thing I want to add there, because it was so interesting as you were saying it, right? So the shadow aspect gets stronger, it gets bigger, it gets more momentum around it. It occupies more influence in your quote unquote personality. And on one hand, that is ultimately of service, right? It blows up and gets bigger to the point of being unignorable, right? Where it becomes almost too agonizing, too obvious, right, to anyone around you, including yourself, to ignore, right? And if you're fortunate, you've either developed some skill and capacity on your own to witness that and choose to no longer remain in that limitation and operate through that agonizing lens. And, or you have people in your life kind enough to call you up on it, right? Whether that's your fellow brothers that you sit with regularly, even a partner, right? Even a wife can play that role, although not always optimal for multiple reasons. So the point of that being that as that grows and gets more momentum and strengthening, it's actually a greater call for you to examine it, for you to essentially rise into that determined stance where this will no longer operate in your life.
Yeah, I love that. That is the beautiful thing about the way the shadow works is it will keep gaining momentum, power, and strength the longer time goes on, the more times it gets triggered and keeps bouncing up and down. And it's really just a call for us to grow into becoming more conscious, you know. The other piece that you mentioned that I really wanted to hit on was you had mentioned that the thing that you started to do was to have a practice centered around celebrating those other people, right? And this is there's so much behind this. Often when we're stuck with a looping shadow and we're experiencing something, the story we have is this is the way reality is, right? Reality is this way. And it becomes difficult for us to imagine reality happening anyway, but this way.
Right.
Especially not in any type of receiving way where we're receiving something in a certain way. And so your strategy of giving it in a certain way is actually the best thing we can do, because it is easier to break that story by giving than it is receiving. And it's a two-way street, right? It's happening on the same pathways inside of us. And yet it's easier for us to give it out than it is to receive it in. And yet giving it out can strengthen the same pathway that allows us to start to receive it in.
Yeah.
And so that's a really important piece of strategy that you shared for men who maybe believe that everybody's out to get them, or, you know, whatever the story is, you know, it doesn't have to be so drastic, but.
Yeah. And it's an empowering stance, right? To give presumes that you are giving from a place of generativity and abundance and from a place of fearlessness, right? To honor someone, right? So a saying that has kind of echoed throughout all of this is only a king can crown, right? When you crown others, you are assuming the authority of your inner king. You can't crown as a beggar, right? You can't crown as someone who has not ascended to a level of being able to offer that gift or that silent affirmation or that silent witnessing of another's achieved mastery, right? And the precursors to it. So that empowering stance over time, right? Of affirming, you know, I see you king, or whatever languaging works for you, or it doesn't even have to be a language-based thing. It could be a nod of approval, right? A silent inner nod when you're witnessing that, whether in person or on social media. That's that little nod, right? Inside your heart, inside your being, that just affirms, right? The mastery that one has attained can go a long way over time in kind of loosening up those structures and reaffirming a stance of power within yourself.
Yeah. So taking this a step further, for men listening to this, how do they know, Ryan, if they are in a looping experience or they're dealing with their shadow? What are some things they may experience that would be reason to give pause and practice self-observation?
Ooh, that's a big question with a lot of different answers to it. I think the one that has been most consistent in most men I've worked with is there is a somatic response, you know, that tightening, that closure that charge. Charge is likely the one that most people who even those who claim aren't energetically sensitive, most will get and understand when they're experiencing charge, right? Especially when you can go from your baseline to charge almost immediately in response to something you saw, something you heard, something that was witnessed, right? So when your baseline shifts drastically, that's often a sign that a shadow aspect has become agitated or inflamed. That would be the simplest way I can describe it, at least from a somatic or a mental emotional standpoint. On the thought level, if you start moving into thoughts of envy, thoughts of jealousy, thoughts of ill will, and ill will is a very difficult one to self-observe and to admit. That one often gets really repressed because most people want to see themselves as good and benevolent, especially those who've done a lot of inner work, right? Any remaining ill will becomes a very difficult, thorny thing to contact, and it must be contacted, right, to be liberated through it. So being willing and daring to see where ill will exists, even within those little thoughts, right? Even if it's within the projected stories, like he's crushing it, but his wife is going to divorce him, right? I hope she takes all his money, right? Like all these little thoughts that might be indicative of ill will and wanting to knock someone back down, likely a very good sign and clear indicator that there is a shadow aspect operating from that place of embodied envy, like we're talking about on this show.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it, and that's great. The charge, that shift in your energetic experience or the sensations, if it's like the stomach drops out or everything gets tight, whatever that is, often there is something there that is agitating something that's already in you, right? So often when we get angry, whether it be at a partner, a child, a client, whatever it is, it's not even about that thing. It's
Right.
triggering something from the past that's still inside of us and has yet to be consciously experienced.
Yeah.
And a powerful, simple quote that I love that just applies to both the shadow and light attributes of other people and situations is, if you spot it, you got it. And it's saying that, like, if you can see something and you have a judgment about somebody else that's negative, it's at least 1% up to 99% true for you too.
Right.
And I've seen this play out, I mean, every single time in men's work, and some of the men's work I do in person. You know, we have a process called a clearing process where somebody has a charge or they're emotional or angry and they clear with another man. And it always comes back to, well, the man who has the charge, something is getting activated that he hasn't dealt with from his past. And so it's always about the man who has the charge. When you get triggered, I don't want to say that it's always only about you, because there are situations where something happening might be actually fucked up or out of bounds or crossing a boundary.
Right.
And it's possible that it's only about that, and it's worth observing and looking within and reflecting on, is this agitating something older?
Right.
Is this about this, or is this about something from my past?
Yeah, there's a lot of practicality to this work, right? And I think that's one thing I want to clarify around shadow work, where a lot of men and women may experience it, something that has to be done on the side, right? Like in a deep dive, I'm going to take this 12-week shadow course. I'm going to read all the Rob Johnson books, right? And all the Jungian archetypes, and just deep dive into this space for a few months. And then my shadow is going to be healed, right? And then I'm going to have before shadow and after shadow life, right? You need life for the most part to trigger and evoke shadow, right? It's not a side practice. It is very much an embodied day-to-day practice of allowing life and all the contexts you're blessed with to mirror and expose what is still there, right? It's that friction of that everyday life and experience that is what lights that fire of illumination. So this is very much practical, right? The liberation of these patterns often are associated quite immediately with richer relationships, more power, more courage, more capacity to do the things you are here to do your work, to express your gifts, to, do all these things that you have in some way denied are possible for you through your envy and your anger and your ill will towards others who've achieved it. So there's an immediate transformation that happens internally and the liberation of that and the regaining of freedom, as well as the practical components of just growing and experiencing growth in the quote unquote more practical realms of life as well.
Yeah. So moving, I want to come back to that expansive piece because I think that's important to anchor that at the end after we offer some remedial. But as far as a remedial practice, and are you ready to go into remedial? Do you have anything else you want to touch on before we share, now that a man is aware of the shadow he's experiencing, where to go?
I think we can move into remedial.
Okay, cool. If you're experiencing that charge that we just talked about, if you're experiencing the trigger and maybe you don't catch it in the moment, maybe and often in the beginning, this is how it works, is later when you're coming back to a place of more neutrality, you may reflect back on a situation where you got really charged and emotional and you're wondering what's up with that, and you start to observe a pathway that we like to take because, like we just mentioned, if you spot it, you got it. You want to explore if that's true. And the way you do that is if you look at a situation where you experience a high level of emotion and you start to look at what story do I have about that situation or that person? What's true about them in relation to this trigger? Let's say, for example, I am triggered by somebody who's a really successful businessman, and the story I have about them is they don't care about anything but money. Now, I could look within and say, well, that's not true about me. But what we're going to ask you to do is look and see if any part of you holds that as true. Because this doesn't have to mean every part of you is aligned with that thing that triggered you. It could just be one part. And then I would look within and say, okay, where is that true for me? Is there any part of me who just cares about money? Okay, I look within and I identify, yeah, actually there is a part of me who is just focused only on making money. The statement you make to start to bring in more compassion, more humanity, as Ryan said earlier, compassion and feeling our common humanity is a really important piece here in dissolving and softening that hard ceiling we mentioned. If you can connect and say, yeah, that's actually true for me, the statement that you make is, this person only cares about money, just like me. And it is acknowledging that that person's a human and a part of them only cares about money, and I'm a human and a part of me only cares about money, using this example, right? And you could insert any shadow piece in there. And you'll most likely, if you dig enough and you examine enough, be able to connect with the part of you that shares the thing that triggered you, right?
What I love about what you just outlined is how shadow ownership becomes quite safe wherever you are on the path, right?
Yeah.
Using the example of being triggered by someone else, you're kind of owning it collaboratively, right? Whether or not that person is actually physically collaborating with you or not, you're kind of in that together, and there's that humanity and the compassion within it. And shadow ownership becomes easier as a result.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's important about that too is it's none of that is about them, right? Like we actually don't know if that's true at all.
Right.
Like it could be 100% false It's
Mm-hmm.
probably 1 to 99% true,
Mm-hmm.
but we have no idea where on that spectrum it falls.
Of course.
And so that's important and helpful to own that. And these are my judgments.
Mm-hmm.
Like our words are powerful. So when we're unfolding the shadow using our words,
Mm.
there's a certain power in saying, these are my judgments.
Mm.
And in all of the work that we do throughout this podcast, throughout the Sacred Men's Council, we are always advocating for men to take radical responsibility, to take ownership, to own their power, which is being responsible,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so when we are really responsible for our words, we're owning more power, and our awareness and acknowledgement is powerful. And so all of this contributes to the softening of that upper limit, so that when we get triggered and we have some time to explore it, that creates a softness for that shadow to bubble up, to be examined.
Mm.
And from a somatic perspective, doing shadow work can be different every time, but there's a common experience somatically where all of a sudden you become aware when you're
Mm-hmm.
examining, where do I do that? And you spot where you do it. Oftentimes there's a movement
Right.
energetically in your body. It could be like a raising up. It could be like a dropping down. It can be different each time, but that movement is that shadow energetically moving within you, literally moving. That energy that was stuck is now
Mm-hmm.
starting to move.
Right.
And that expansive experience Ryan mentioned, that's freedom. That's
Mm-hmm.
freedom somatically being experienced, because something that was suppressed is no longer being suppressed.
Yeah. And that's experienced sometimes in circle, right? When a man will be like, oof, whoa,
Yeah.
right? Whoa. And
Yeah.
that's the beauty of sharing that space while immersed in shadow work. And the constant observation of that is the group itself is kind of a version of that non-judgmental spaciousness that you are cultivating within, right? And when in a group, you can begin by saying, I'm observing, and you go on to talk about something that you previously would have thought was too much, right? Too dirty, too gross, too shameful, too far away from how you want to be perceived or how you self-identify, right? And if you could say, I am observing this hatred and ill will towards people who have successfully passed clown college, right? Or whatever you want to say. And you experience that landing safely within the consciousness of the group without anyone saying, like, without anyone judging you for it, for lack of a better word, right? And it just entering space and dissolving, that's where you feel that, oof, right? And that is what you are entraining yourself to experience within yourself, that it actually is safe to witness, confront, take ownership of, reveal these patterns, these ideas, these thoughts, and it not be so calamitous to you and your self-identity.
Yeah, that is really a powerful addition. You can do all this work on your own. You can do it in a journaling practice. You can certainly do it on the cushion in private. And when you do it in a group, often there's a recognition that men, especially men who have done the work for a while, there's a recognition of like, oh, I know what he's doing right now. Like I've experienced this, and like respect. And so the energy that is being held is one of like, for the warrior who is going through the battlefield
Mm-hmm.
and is going to be hoisted up after,
Right.
and like in a way that's safe, not in a way that's, ideally the way we run our group, at least, and we can speak for ourselves, in a way where that work is safe and it's not going to be dissected and judged and things like that. It's just a matter of we see where you are, we honor you for being there, and we can hold the space and help you when you need the help to move through it.
I love that. Cool. How do we wish to wrap this one up?
I think, and we're going to put in the membership space beneath this video, we'll put that practice we mentioned and maybe a link to some other work that men can begin working on. And of course, if this type of work is something that you're wanting to explore more deeply with support, we have the Sacred Men's Council, and we'll put links to how men can seek out a private invitation to that also in the comments below.
Very cool. The last note I want to bring to the table is that shadow work is cleansing work. It's the work of purification, right? And often when we quote unquote confront the shadow, it's framed as such a scary, fruitless, rewardless endeavor. And it actually is one of the richer, more empowering, more cleansing practices we can endeavor to participate in on the path, right? When you look at how confession was a thing, right, in various sects of Christianity, it was in many ways meant as a cleansing practice, right? To let go of the burden of this thing you've been carrying. Those were mostly often associated with deeds, right? Things you have done. Less so the precursors that drove those deeds. Shadow work is very much saying, oof, this is what's operating under the surface. These are the judgments, beliefs, feelings driving these actions. It's one step deeper, right? It's cleansing at the root, and it is driving you towards behavioral change that comes quite naturally, right? As these patterns simply go offline. They're not repressed, they're not controlled, they're not stuffed away, they're not fought with. They simply go offline and get transmuted into a more fruitful, more generative, more virtuous stance in relation to what you were previously in a shadow-based relationship to.
Yeah, beautiful, man. I love that addition. That feels like the end.
That's the end. Let's close it down.
Okay. All right, men. So come into a place of stillness, just really noticing how all this is landing for you. At this time, we want to open up, activate, and strengthen your exit portal so you can release anything and everything not in alignment with your highest and best good. Anything that is right and perfect for you to integrate, we're going to roll up onto your midline, consolidating all of it on your midline so that it can be time released in right and perfect timing, insulating you so that you can do this work in your sovereign space within your own body and energy system. At this time, we dedicate this work to the upliftment of suffering and confusion for all sentient beings. And at this time, we are going to wrap up our session, our space, sealing all the seams, guarding all the gates, protecting all the thresholds, sealing, guarding, protecting, protecting. It is sealed, it is finished, it is done, so it is, and so be it.